Thank you very much indeed, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I am aware that I am something of an odd fit to be keynoting this conference. And I would, as I proceed through my remarks, I would only ask that you bear in mind that I was not the person who extended the invitation. I will do my best to offer some reflections that may bear in perhaps oblique ways, but I think perhaps not insignificant ways, on some of your concerns. And in particular, I think what I have to say may touch on how the events through which we are passing may affect and even transform the social environment in which individuals will come to operate in years to come. Also the standards of success and accomplishment that we will apply in the future, and how they may differ from those that have applied in the immediate past. I will do so largely by addressing not the issues that I know concern you, but the issues that concern me. I'm more familiar with those. And I should say, I will, had I chance to do it again, I would simply have simplified my title to read very simply, Cognition and the Crisis. I spent the last 2 years, and certainly the last year in an extremely intensive way, working on the problems thrown up by the financial events that became the dominant fact in our public lives and also in large extent in our private lives in September and October of 2008. I cannot claim that I spent my entire career before that working on financial crises, but the theoretical tradition in economics in which I was raised was certainly familiar with the phenomenon. In 1955, my father made his literary reputation with the publication of a small book called The Great Crash, 1929, which has been continuously in print, I might say, ever since. Which in many ways laid down the template for an argument about the significance of financial events of this kind, traumas of this kind in American life. The key figure in the post-war period working on these issues was an obscure loner who spent most of his career at Washington University in St. Louis named Hyman Minsky, whose most important book, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy, appeared in the late 1970s. And I read it at the time and reviewed it at the time. It was not a book which carried very far in the economics profession. I entered professional life in the middle 1970s on the staff of the US Congress, as you've heard, and I found myself initially on the staff of the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives, involved immediately and continuously with the cycle of financial instability and crises which began to emerge at that time, very much on the periphery of the larger intellectual life of the economics profession, but very much at the center of the lives of those who were affected. The crisis in the finances of the city of New York in 1975-76, the rescue of the Chrysler Corporation in 1979, the massive crisis that affected the third world and the solvency of the US banking system in the early 1980s, and then through the 1990s, the events that led up to the crisis in Asia in 1997, to the crisis in Russia in 1998. And then as these events came back and these processes came back to become a dominant feature of American economic life, the bubble and bust of information technology sector in the late 1990s and 2000, and ultimately the events which were largely centered in housing that have led to the sensational and in many ways system-altering circumstances that we presently face. That's the course of one person's professional engagement, professional and public engagement. And if you go through this over a lifetime, I can tell you, you get a feel for the rhythm of these things, for the fact that they tend to consume one class of assets after another, and for the sense that they grow larger and more threatening, and each one is contained and each one is dealt with, simply sets the stage for a subsequent and larger set of problems going forward. So one develops, as I say, a certain instinctive or experiential feel for these developments. But at the same time, and over the same period, I found that the profession, the academic discipline which I had entered 30 years ago, was systematically and perhaps even increasingly disengaged from these concerns. There was some practical work. Each of these crises would inspire academic conferences, as you might imagine, occasional studies, books compiling the papers that were written as the events developed. There was some emergence of economic theory relating to these questions in an effort to understand them, turning largely on the concept of the bubble, which is, I would describe as an effort to express a metaphor in mathematical terms, something that I think is very much what economists try to do with their time. It was clearly embarrassing for the profession as a whole when two Nobel Prize winners in finance, Merton and Scholes, were associated with a firm which was supposedly based on their ideas, which collapsed in the crisis of 1998. The firm was called Long-Term Capital Management, and it proved to be roughly as durable as the Thousand-Year Reich. But in general, the main lines of thinking in economics rejected the study of crisis and developed, concentrated on a pattern of thought, a pattern of modeling that basically systematically denied the possibility of crisis. It was a pattern of modeling which presupposed the superiority of the particular institutional frameworks under which we've come to live, that is to say, the stability of a market-based economy, and a pattern which emphasized the concept of a long-term equilibrium to which the system naturally tended, and therefore its self-correcting properties. So it became very difficult for economists even to talk about the problem of unemployment as a phenomenon affecting people in an involuntary sense, still less to talk about the risk that the system itself might prove intrinsically unstable, intrinsically fragile, intrinsically prone to collapse. Like the Keynesian orthodoxy of the 1960s, which believed that government policy could effectively manage all contingencies affecting economic performance, the group that called themselves the New Classicals, and that came into a dominant position in the 80s and 90s, believed in the end of history, the triumph of their system, the solution of all problems, and particularly all problems relating to system performance as a whole. They were so confident of this that within my field, the study of history, the study of alternative perspectives, and the study of the history of economics itself tended to disappear. In fact, it dropped completely from most graduate programs in the field in my professional lifetime. Real scientists reasoned from first principles. They did not study the past, and they used facts in a kind of ad hoc way to illustrate the operation of previously decided first principles rather than to think critically of the perspectives that they were advancing. I hope you're getting from this, at least in some sense, the outlines of a cognitive problem. You can perhaps see how someone like me, who was trained in an earlier era and whose professional experience was in this sideline of financial crises, began to feel like the last member of a lost tribe, basically unable to communicate professionally because there was no one around who still spoke the language in which I was raised. It's a very interesting and somewhat disconcerting experience to have in the middle of one's professional career. And then the crisis happened. An enormous event for people who work in my area. And it's been met within my profession by a combination of astonishment and denial. The wise men say, no one foresaw it. No one could have foreseen it. And as they say that, they blithely ignore the actual existing people who did. To take the case, rather admirable case in most respects, of my friend Paul Krugman, who wrote a very damning article in the New York Sunday Times Magazine about 5 or 6 weeks ago. Paul, in that article, actually states in a passing paragraph that there were people who foresaw the crisis, but they didn't get anywhere inside the larger economics profession, and that's entirely true. But he doesn't go on to name them or to describe the work of the people whose work was actually relevant to an understanding of present events. There were sessions at the most recent national meetings of the American Economic Association devoted to the crisis, but no one who had actual foresight into these events was invited to speak. The participants were all amongst the people who didn't foresee the crisis and who then met to describe why it could not be foreseen. The Wall Street Journal, it's true, in an article that ran 2 or 3 days ago, did talk about the emergence of a new paradigm in my subject, and it had found one very capable finance professor at Yale University who had noticed that if you have too much leverage and too little collateral, this can get you into financial difficulties. I shouldn't say he's the first one to notice it, but the merit lies in stating this in a sufficiently sophisticated mathematical form. I'm tempted to send him a copy of my father's book. But again, in general, we're talking about a discipline in which this colossal historical event has, as of yet, generated very little new work, very few new ideas, and practically no reassessment of a calamitous professional failure. At my own university, I'm reliably informed, I don't keep track of it myself, that the economics department has yet to hold a single seminar on the crisis. And I don't think that's uncharacteristic of the position of the profession in the larger country. So as I hinted a few minutes ago, the story about the behavior of established professionals in the face of a systemic shock to their belief system has a certain relationship to the field of cognitive disability. And I would therefore invite you to study it. But let me pass on and say a few words about the larger question. What does this mean, not just for this group of only marginally relevant professionals, but rather for the larger society in which we live and in which you work, and with which the people that you are concerned are going to have to cope going forward. I think it's fair to say that one of the great virtues of American society is, or has been, there's widely shared confidence in its basic decency, in the functionality and the fitness for purpose of the economic world into which people are introduced at a relatively early age, and optimism about the future over the medium term. In other words, one of the operational characteristics of the society is the idea of the capacity for recuperation. This was built, this is not something that was historically always there. It was built from experience over a 60-year period after the Depression of the 1930s. I think it, in fact, was not part of the psychology of people who were raised, of age in my mother's generation in the late 1920s, early 1930s. But it has become deeply ingrained. It gives us a very high degree of trust in each other, and this facilitates economic relations. It makes the making of contracts and agreements much more straightforward than it would otherwise be. It also gives us a culture where second and third chances are normal, where the overcoming of handicaps is considered to be a distinct possibility in everybody's life, where the competition is not so extreme that large classes of people consider themselves to have lost out from the beginning. And so one has the capacity to mitigate the effect of initial setbacks and failures. And it has given us, I should say, those of us who are part of the historically largely white middle class, a feeling that if we did fail, that was a personal matter. To say it was not a group matter. It's not true of all elements of our society, because there is obvious patterns of discrimination that affect groups, and groups are justifiably aware of it. But for a very large part of the society, the sense that that failure was a personal matter and not a feature of the broader system. Okay? All of which lent to the system a very high degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the largest number of people participating in it. We see this optimism today carrying over in the discourse of politicians and the press with respect to the crisis. We use the word recession, a clearly temporary term, which in our experience is followed by recovery. One already sees seminars and meetings that are entitled "The Economy Post-Crisis," or questions get posed. I'm on television quite a bit, and I'm frequently asked whether we are taking appropriate steps to prevent it from happening again, as though it were already over. So this is part of the way we think about things, and it's not a bad thing if it corresponded to the reality, or at least it wouldn't be a bad thing. There is, in economics, professional reinforcement for this in some new work. Professor George Akerlof and at Berkeley, Rob Schiller at Yale have a book entitled Animal Spirits, which emphasizes the feedback loop from psychological predisposition to recovery itself. That is to say, everything depends upon confidence. I fear that much of this type of thinking is reflexive. It's a product of our national culture rather than based upon a reasoned analysis of the events through which we are passing. What I suspect is that the crisis will confound these expectations for quite a long time. And I have two basic reasons for thinking that. And I think they are fairly well known to ordinary observers. But they have not been, so far as I can tell, adequately assimilated into either the professional discussion in my field or the popular discussion, the popular sensibility of the press or of the political leadership. The first reason concerns the character of events that led to the crisis in the first place. It is very different from the business cycle fluctuations of most of the post-war period, most of which were actually set off by shocks emanating from abroad. The oil crisis of the 1970s is an example, or policy actions intended to discipline the system because it was getting out of control in one respect or another, usually because of rising inflation. That is to say, specific tightening of policy by the Federal Reserve. This is not what has happened this time. This crisis is rooted in a very profound abuse of power. And the rise under cover of that abuse, of what I think is fair to call a culture of corruption at the very heart of the financial sector. The abuse was the opportunistic deregulation and desupervision of financial firms. That is to say, the creation of an environment in which conduct which 20 or 30 years previously would clearly have been prohibited, would clearly have been, and was when it emerged, attacked by vigilant regulators and by conscientious prosecutors, became not only tolerated, but quickly the norm in a major part of the industry. That is to say, amongst people who were originating mortgages and peddling them to relatively low-income communities, low-income families, mortgages which the originators, the lenders, knew very well, were structured so that they would become unbearable and unserviceable within, say, 2 or 3 years. Mortgages whose values were exaggerated by appraisers who were paid to overstate the value of the homes on which they were based, all for the sake of maximizing the fees, because the system made it possible for those mortgages, however unreliable, to be sold within a very short period of time to a system, to the securities underwriters, who would then package them, present them to the ratings agencies, which would then sanctify them with a AAA rating and pass them along to the broad investment community. The culture of corruption that resulted from this permissive regulatory environment can be documented by an audit of the loan book, that is to say, of the documentation behind these loans, audits which have not systematically occurred. And I think the reason for it is that the government does not wish to know, very straightforwardly, because the consequences of doing a systematic survey would lead to conclusions requiring action on a scale that the government does not wish to contemplate. But we do have some evidence. The ratings agency Fitch in 2007 did a sample of a very small number of well-rated securities, mortgages that had been the basis of very well-rated securities, and what it found was, in its own words, fraud or misrepresentation in virtually every file. That is to say, did not find files in which there wasn't fraud or misrepresentation. And if that turns out to be a systematic characteristic of the system as a whole, and there's no reason, so far as we know, to believe otherwise, then you begin to get a sense of the scale of the difficulty that we face. But you don't need really to do the audits. Language itself is very helpful here. We can ask how people in the industry themselves characterized what they were doing. They talked about no-doc loans. Ninja loans, loans given to people with no income, no jobs, or assets. Right? Neutron loans, borrowed from the nuclear age, loans that would destroy the people but leave the buildings intact. Right? This is a language of a corrupted culture. And those who were in the industry also had a little code for expressing their personal position. It's a code with 6 letters. It was IBG, YBG. So, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Right? This is not a culture of responsibility over the medium or long term. And what I think is inevitable in this situation, and what is happening, and what we have to come to grips with, is that this must lead to a collapse of trust. A collapse of trust, and therefore a collapse of the markets themselves. Not just in these particular area of subprime mortgage-backed securities, but practically all the secondary mortgage markets, indeed practically all the credit markets, except those operated directly by the state. And when the state takes over a large part of the credit markets, then the people who are in the other parts decide they would rather be with the state because it's safer. And suddenly you don't have a private credit system that in any way resembles what was existing just a few months or years before. Okay? Very major change, and it has happened. Second thing that I think we have to come to grips with, alongside this collapse of trust, is so central to the concept of credit, is a collapse in private financial wealth. That is to say, in our sense of ourselves as a middle-class society. It's true that for quite a few people, things are actually much worse. Millions of people have lost their jobs and are now living on unemployment insurance and disability and other state-based income streams. Millions have lost their homes, and many hundreds of thousands will lose their homes going forward. So there is acute privation in part of the population. So that's clear. But that is not the crisis as most of us are experiencing it. For most of us, the loss is much less tangible. It's in those statements that come in on a monthly basis, the value of the stocks held in a retirement account, the interest return on a cash holding, and above all, something which is not actually recorded in any statement, the price of a house that you're still living in and that you do not immediately plan to sell. So daily life goes on pretty much as before. There is work and there is consumption. But the effect is to constrain the possibilities out into the future. There are cars and appliances that won't be bought. People realize that the very good substitute for the car you would like to have is the one you've already got, right? There are professional risks that you might have taken when you had a large financial cushion that you won't take now. There are entry-level jobs that your children will not be able to get. And there are retirements that will be deferred or that simply won't have the same luminous quality that you thought they would have when all of those statements looked very fat. In material terms, there's a psychological impoverishment that's immediate and a material impoverishment which comes along quite slowly as your possessions grow old. What I want to suggest is one can begin to imagine and should think about the possibility that this condition will be with us for a long time, that it may, in fact, be part of our lives indefinitely, influencing in the way in which the Great Depression influenced the lives of professionals who were coming of age in the early 1930s, perhaps in a permanent way, marking a permanent phase in our existence as a society. So the question going forward is, if this is a fact, how will it affect the psychology of economic life? I mentioned already the easy trust, the sense of personal responsibility, the medium-term optimism, all of which motivate us to work for effort in this country. And how will these conditions affect perceptions of social institutions, and particularly our view of the political leadership, when over time it becomes increasingly clear that that political leadership fails to understand, perhaps exhibits a certain indifference, and in any event is so tied up in the contradictions and stalemates of American politics that it is impotent to act effectively in response to these emerging conditions. And how will our psychology of life be affected as we perceive that there is nevertheless a small group of people who manage to do very well and for whom the system continues to function, right? That the banks and the bankers in particular have been rescued by the combination of basically free money from the Federal Reserve and the capacity to earn interest from the Treasury in ways which are not available to ordinary people. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to worry about these issues. In fact, it's clearly emerging now. And it's not, I think, accidental that the term depression has both economic and psychological meanings. In fact, was obviously borrowed by economics from psychology, or possibly by psychology from economics. What I would underline here is that the psychological element can be rooted in rational cognition, and that this can have very profound consequences for the way in which we actually live our lives in the world. Those consequences are obviously very far from benign. Is there a way out of this? I cannot say to you that I'm optimistic about the spontaneous resurrection of everyone's financial wealth. That would be the easy way out. It is certainly a habit amongst business economists, many of whom would very much like to restore your interest in purchasing common stock, and amongst economists associated with the financial markets, to always predict that there will be a recovery starting in 6 months. And you can look it up. It's just as, I mean, since you don't know what's going to happen in 6 months, you might as well say 3% from that point forward. And in fact, there will be, no question about it, there is already underway the influence of stabilizing forces, the very large deficits, and the very easy monetary policy that we put in place over the last year. But these forces, while strong enough to prevent a complete and immediate collapse, are, in my view, not strong enough to deal with the issues that I just raised, and in particular with the problem of the exhaustion of the financial wealth of the American middle class. So what could be done? There are two things here, it seems to me, that are possible. One is political action. The state is large, it is powerful. It has institutions which were created in the New Deal and the Great Society, which impart to it a capacity and a stability that it did not have 70 years ago. It's the reason why you can get refunded for 5 years on these important work that you're doing in the present environment. That is not, I think, coming from private charity. Political action also has a second characteristic. It can restore to us a sense of motivation, a sense of common purpose, and a cause of action. This need not be, in other words, something which is entirely and always motivated by the search for personal wealth. In our history, we've had moments, the Second World War, the New Deal, the Great Society, in which very large parts of the country, perhaps all of it in certain moments, were motivated to action for reasons other than personal economic gain. It's quite possible to imagine doing that again, and it's fairly straightforward to imagine the goals and objectives to which a common social effort could be put. We face enormous problems, obviously, in the area of energy and the environment, and these problems are going to require the substantial mobilization of effort over a 15, 20, 25-year horizon if they're going to be dealt with effectively. I don't think that can be done except by the mechanisms that we have for common social purpose. So that's one broad possibility. And the second, it seems to me, would be to begin to recognize that perhaps the particular society which we developed in the last generation, and the particular conception of personal well-being, perhaps that was a little bit anomalous in human society. That is to say, we developed a country with a deep preoccupation with personal accounting, with these intangible measures, personalized measures of financial wealth and security, and that this is not characteristic of American life throughout our history as a republic, and it's not terribly characteristic of life in most of the rest of the world. I've just come from a few days in China. I don't believe that Chinese households have any conception of the concept of personal net worth that remotely resembles the way American households think about it. Why? Because they don't have the institutional and social experience that we've developed over the course of the post-war period. And as this fades, and it may well be fading in a way which is very long-lasting, maybe we will simply cease to be quite so preoccupied with it. Maybe we could begin to develop a society in which our work, our cultural accomplishments, our social life, our sense of fairness, the general standard for the whole population, your work with helping people who have who come into society with disabilities and impairments, where these things become the true and dominant measure of how well we're doing. And if we did that over a period of time, that would also perhaps not be a bad way out of the problem that we're facing. Thanks very much.